The air in the Henderson Implement showroom hung thick and heavy, a potent cocktail of new rubber, fresh green and yellow paint, and the faint, sharp tang of diesel fuel. It was the smell of progress, the smell of money. It was 1973, and in the heart of Iowa, progress was measured in horsepower and the size of your bank loan. Arthur Miller stood at the parts counter, a grimy water pump gasket held tight in his calloused hand. The part was for his father's 1951 Farmall M, the tractor he'd learned to drive on, the tractor that had paid for the very land he now worked. Its red paint was faded to a dull, sun-baked orange, its sheet metal scarred with the dings and scrapes of 2 decades of honest labor. To Art, those scars were a family history written in steel. To everyone else in this showroom, they were a punchline. "Can't find a listing for this one, Art," said the young parts man, flipping through a thick catalogue with a sigh. "That's an old one. Might have to order it from the warehouse in Moline. Take a week, maybe more." Behind him, a roar of laughter erupted from the main office. Frank Gable, his neighbor to the west, strode out, slapping the dealership owner, Bill Henderson, on the back. Frank was 10 years younger than Art, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was the poster boy for the new way of farming. Lease it, finance it, leverage it. Get big or get out. "Just signed on the dotted line, boys," Frank announced to the room at large. "She's all mine. A brand new John Deere, 40 or for 30. Turbocharged, 125 horses at the PTO and that sound guard cab. Air conditioning, radio. I might just sleep in the thing." Henderson, a portly man whose belt buckle strained against the fabric of his shirt, beamed like a proud father. "Frank here knows the future when he sees it, don't you, Frank? Can't make money sitting on your hands, farming with relics." His eyes slid over to Art, standing quietly at the counter. The comment was a dart, and it found its mark. Art felt the familiar heat rise in his neck, but he kept his face, a mask of placid neutrality. He'd been hearing variations of that sentiment for years, ever since his father passed, and he took over the Miller farm. Frank swaggered over, his new John Deere cap perched jauntily on his head. "Still trying to keep that old M running, Art? Hell, my boy's got a pedal tractor with more modern features. Why don't you let Bill here put you in a real machine? He'll make you a deal on a 40-20 trade-in. It's time to join the 20th century." Art looked from Frank's smug face to Henderson's predatory grin. He knew the game. They saw him as a dinosaur, an obstacle to a sale. He simply held up the worn gasket. "She just needs a new gasket, Frank. Runs like a top otherwise. Doesn't owe me a dime." Henderson let out a short, derisive laugh. It was a sound Art would remember for the rest of his life. It was dismissive, condescending, and utterly final. "Doesn't owe you a dime, but it doesn't make you a dime either," Henderson scoffed, his voice loud enough for the other farmers lingering in the showroom to hear. "You can't plant 400 acres of corn with a 35-horsepower tractor from the Truman administration and expect to keep up. You're pouring good money after bad. Frankly, Art, you're a fool for keeping that old thing. A sentimental fool." The word hung in the air, thick and greasy as old motor oil. Fool. The other farmers shuffled their feet, suddenly finding the tire treads on a new planter intensely interesting. No one met Art's eyes. In their silence, they agreed. Art felt a cold, hard knot form in his gut. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a deep, resonant resolve, the kind that settles in a man's bones and stiffens his spine. He looked Henderson square in the eye. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, devoid of emotion. "Maybe I am," he said. "But when I climb down off that tractor at the end of the day, I sleep soundly. The only one I owe is myself." Bill, if you find that gasket, give me a call at the house." He placed the old part on the counter, turned his back on the gleaming new tractors and the men who worshipped them, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The screen door of the dealership slammed shut behind him, a final, tinny punctuation mark on their judgment. As he climbed into his dusty Ford pickup, he could see Frank Gable in the rearview mirror, already climbing up into the palatial cab of his new 4430, a king ascending his green and yellow throne, a king who owed the bank a fortune. Before we go any further, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like Art? Someone who stuck to his guns, who held on to the old ways when the whole world was screaming at him to change, calling him a fool? Or maybe you knew a Frank Gable, a man who flew too close to the sun on borrowed wings, believing that debt was just another word for opportunity. Let me know down in the comments which man you respect more, and why. It's a question that defined a generation of farmers, and the answer wasn't always as simple as it looked. Back in the quiet solitude of his workshop, Art felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The shop was his sanctuary. It smelled of history, of cold steel, penetrating oil, and the faint, sweet scent of sawdust from the wooden workbench his grandfather had built from oak cleared off their own land. Tools hung in their proper places on a vast pegboard wall, each wrench, socket, and screwdriver outlined in white paint, a system of order his father had instilled in him. This was a place of logic, of cause and effect. A bolt was either tight or it was loose. An engine either ran or it didn't. There was no room for opinions or mockery here, only the unyielding laws of mechanics. He set the ailing water pump from the Farmall M on the bench, its cast-iron housing stained with rust and years of seeping coolant. The words from the dealership still echoed in his mind. Fool. Relic. He picked up a half-inch wrench, its steel worn smooth and cool against his palm. Torque was cheap. Work was real. He wedged the pump into the heavy jaws of his bench vise and cranked the handle until it was held fast. The first bolt was stubborn, seized by decades of heat cycles and corrosion. He fitted the wrench, gave it a sharp tug. Nothing. He repositioned himself, planting his feet, and put his weight into it. The steel of the wrench groaned in protest, and his knuckles went white. Then, with a sudden, sharp crack that echoed in the quiet shop, the bolt broke free. A small victory. He worked with a patient, methodical rhythm. He knew this machine intimately, the way a man knows the back of his own hand. He knew the precise tension for the fan belt, the peculiar angle needed to slip the lower radiator hose off its fitting without tearing the old rubber. He scraped away the remnants of the old gasket with a putty knife, its brittle, paper-thin flakes falling away like dead skin, revealing the clean, machined surface underneath. He ran his finger over the cast iron, feeling for any burrs or imperfections that could compromise the new seal. This was what men like Henderson and Gable didn't understand. They saw an old tractor. Art saw a legacy. He saw his father, grease up to his elbows, teaching him how to set the timing. He saw himself as a boy of 10, perched on the fender, watching the neat, dark rows of earth curl away from the plow. This tractor wasn't just a machine, it was a part of him, and maintaining it wasn't a chore. It was an act of preservation, of respect. It was a promise he'd made to his father's memory to never let the farm fall into the hands of a banker. After an hour of meticulous work, the new gasket Henderson's parts man had finally found in a dusty bin was in place, coated with a thin, tacky layer of sealant. He bolted the pump back onto the engine block, torquing the bolts in a star pattern to ensure an even seal. He reattached the hoses, tightened the clamps, and refilled the radiator with a 50-50 mix of coolant and water. He wiped his hands on a red shop rag, the grease leaving dark stains. He climbed onto the iron seat, the cold steel a familiar comfort. He pulled the choke, turned the key, and hit the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a throaty cough and settled into its iconic, rhythmic pop, pop, pop idle. The sound was music to Art's ears, the steady, reliable heartbeat of his farm. He watched the water pump pulley spin, looking for any sign of a leak. It was bone dry. He gave the throttle a little nudge, and the engine responded with a healthy roar, the exhaust puffing a contented cloud of blue-white smoke into the afternoon air. The story of Art's confrontation at the dealership travelled through the county with the speed of gossip at a church potluck. At the grain elevator, as he waited in line to unload his soybeans, he'd see men nudge each other and fall silent as he approached. At the co-op, he overheard a younger farmer talking about Frank Gable's new Orthiortha 30. "That's how you get ahead," the young man said. "You got to spend money to make money. Can't be scared of debt." The scorn was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of his life. One afternoon, while he was out cultivating his corn with the M, Frank Gable drove past on the gravel road in his new tractor, pulling a field cultivator twice the width of Art's. He didn't just drive by. He slowed down, the air-conditioned cab a silent bubble of judgment, and gave Art a long, pitying look before kicking up a cloud of dust and roaring away. The message was clear. I am the future. You are the past. Even at home, the pressure was there, albeit gentler. His wife, Sarah, was a practical woman who trusted him implicitly, but she saw the new washing machines and color televisions appearing in her friends' homes. "Are you sure we're doing the right thing, Art?" she asked one evening, as they sat on the porch swing, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. "The Heffermans just bought a new combine, a gleaner, said they got a great deal from the bank." Art took her hand, his rough palm enveloping her softer one. "The Heffermans also have a mortgage the size of the national debt, Sarah. We own this land. We own our house. We own our machines. When the harvest is done, the money is ours, not the bank's. There's a peace in that. It's worth more than a new combine." She squeezed his hand and leaned her head on his shoulder, but he could feel the worry that lingered in her silence. The real cost of his philosophy became brutally clear a week later, in the heart of planting season. He was in the far 80, pulling his 4-row John Deere planter with his other reliable workhorse, a late model Farmall H. The sun was beating down, the soil was perfect, and he was making good time. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered, coughed black smoke, and died. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Art climbed down, his gut tightening. He went through the checklist. Fuel. The tank was half full. He pulled a plug wire, held it near the block, and cranked the engine. No spark. He knew immediately what it was, the magneto. He spent a precious hour taking it apart right there in the field, his tools laid out on a greasy rag. The condenser had failed. It was a simple $10 part, but it had brought his entire operation to a standstill. He drove the 10 miles into town. The first auto parts store didn't have it. The second one had to look it up in a book. So old the pages were yellowed and brittle. They had one, in a faded box on a high shelf, covered in dust. By the time he got back to the field, fixed the magneto, and got the H running again, he had lost over 4 hours of prime planting time. 4 hours on a perfect day you could never get back. As he worked late into the evening, the tractor's headlights cutting lonely swaths through the darkness, he saw the distant lights of Frank Gable's 4430 finally shut off. Frank was done for the day. He'd probably planted 80 acres in the time it took Art to plant 30. The dealer's words came back to him, unbidden. A sentimental fool. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into Art's heart. The next few years were a blur of hard work and high prices. The world, it seemed, was hungry, and the American farmer was there to feed it. In 1974, President Nixon, mired in Watergate, urged farmers to plant fence row to fence row to combat global food shortages and soaring inflation. The Russian grain deal had opened up a massive new market, and commodity prices shot to the moon. Corn, which had been $1.50 a bushel when Art took over the farm, was suddenly pushing $3. Soybeans were double that. It felt like the good times would never end. For men like Frank Gable, it was a golden age. The high prices justified any expense, any loan. He used his new 4430 as collateral to buy the 80-acre parcel that bordered Art's property to the north, a piece of ground Art had always coveted, but couldn't justify the soaring price for. The ink was barely dry on that deal when Frank traded the year-old 4430 for a brand-new, more powerful 46630. He built a massive Morton machine shed, its steel roof gleaming in the sun, a monument to his success. He was the man the bankers loved, the farmer everyone else wanted to be. He was making a fortune, at least on paper. His net worth swelled with the appreciating value of his land, but so did the river of debt flowing beneath it. Art felt the pull of that current, but he refused to be swept away. The windfall from the high grain prices was real, and it was tempting. He could have easily walked into Henderson Implement and driven out in a new tractor of his own. Instead, he took his profits and did something that baffled his neighbors. He paid things off. He settled his annual operating loan at the bank in July instead of December. He put a new roof on the barn and paid the contractor in cash. He methodically built up a savings account, a cushion of security in an industry that had none. His one major purchase was a used John Deere 4020, a 1968 model with 5,000 hours on it. It was a legendary tractor, powerful and reliable, and a huge step up from his old Farmalls for heavy tillage. He found it sitting on a consignment lot, its green paint faded, but its engine sound. He haggled the owner down another $500 and wrote him a check on the spot. When the 4020 was delivered, Frank Gable stopped by on his way into town. He walked around it, kicking the tires, a smirk playing on his lips. "Finally decided to get a real tractor, Art," he said. "It's a good start. But you know, for just a little more a month, you could have a new one, with a warranty, and a cab." "This one's paid for, Frank," Art said simply, checking the oil. "Everything's paid for eventually," Frank laughed, climbing back into his new pickup. "You're just paying for it with sweat instead of interest. You're missing the boat, Art. This is the time to expand. You're being too timid." Timid. That was the new word they used for him. Not a fool anymore, but timid. A man afraid to take a risk. A man without vision. He watched Frank drive off, and he couldn't deny the sting. It was hard to feel like you were winning when the man next door was buying up the county and you were celebrating a 15-year-old tractor. One crisp autumn afternoon in 1979, Art was at the First National Bank in town, making his final deposit from the fall harvest. The farm was in the black for the year, with a healthy surplus tucked away in savings. Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, a man with thinning grey hair and tired eyes, initialed the deposit slip. "You're one of the few, Arthur," Abernathy said, leaning on the counter. "Most of the accounts I see these days are just a revolving door for loan payments. Money comes in from the elevator, goes right back out to the implement dealer or the finance company. You run a tight ship." "It's the way my dad taught me," Art replied. "A wise man," Abernathy said, his gaze drifting to the street outside. I wish more folks around here had his sense. All this expansion. Land prices are through the roof. These operating loans are based on an asset value that feels inflated. It makes me nervous. He lowered his voice. You hear the news out of Washington? The president just put a new man in charge of the Federal Reserve, a fellow named Paul Volcker. A real hawk, they say. He's talking about breaking the back of inflation, no matter the cost. Talking about interest rates. Art didn't follow politics closely, but he knew what interest rates were. How high could they go? Abernathy gave a grim, humorless smile. That's the question, isn't it? The prime rate is already at 12%. Some of these economists are saying it could go to 15, maybe even 20, before it's all over. 20%. The number seemed impossible, like something from another world. Art felt a small, cold knot tighten in his stomach. He thought of his savings, earning a safe but modest 5%. Then he thought of Frank Gable, with his new tractors, his new land, his new machine shed, all of it financed with variable rate loans. What would 20% interest do to a man like that? As if on cue, a brand new, gleaming, black Ford F-250 pickup truck with chrome running boards pulled up to the curb outside the bank. Frank Gable hopped out, leaving the engine running. He was wearing a new seed corn jacket and a confident grin. He waved at Abernathy and Art through the plate glass window before heading into the post office next door. The truck was a perfect symbol of the times. Big, shiny, powerful, and almost certainly bought with borrowed money. Art looked from the truck to the worried face of the bank president, and then back to his own deposit slip. The numbers on it suddenly felt more important, more real, than all the new iron in Frank Gable's shed. The air was changing. A storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The good years, as it turned out, were a mirage shimmering on a hot summer blacktop. The first sign of trouble wasn't a cloud in the sky, but a voice on the radio. In January of 1980, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. To a nation of corn and soybean farmers who had been told to plant fence row to fence row for that very market, it was like turning off a spigot at the main valve. The price of corn at the local elevator, which had been flirting with $3 a bushel, fell by 50 cents overnight. By spring, it was struggling to stay above 2. The ripple of shock that went through the farming community was palpable. At the co-op, the usual banter about planting progress was replaced with hushed, anxious conversations about basis points and loan extensions. Art saw the change in Frank Gable first. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, coiled energy. His new Ford pickup was always caked in mud now, the chrome dulled by a film of road dust. Art saw him one morning at the parts counter at Henderson's, not buying anything new, just arguing with Bill Henderson over the bill for a service call. $400 to replace a hydraulic pump seal on the 4630? Frank's voice was sharp, edged with desperation. Bill, that's robbery. The tractor's barely 2 years old. It's a complex system, Frank, Henderson said, his own jovial demeanor strained. It's not like your daddy's old 2-cylinder. It takes a trained technician and specialized tools, and the part had to be shipped from Waterloo. My hands are tied. Frank snatched the invoice and stormed out without another word. A few weeks later, Art was cultivating his corn with the old Farmall M. The summer was turning out to be a scorcher, with weeks passing without a meaningful rain. The ground was hard and dusty, and the young corn plants were already showing signs of stress, their leaves curling inward to conserve moisture. As he reached the end of a row, he saw Frank's 4630 sitting idle in the middle of the adjacent field, a massive 12-row cultivator buried in the dirt behind it. Frank was nowhere in sight. Art shut down the M and walked across the dry, cracking earth. As he got closer, he saw the problem. The inside dual tire on the left side of the big tractor was completely flat, the rim resting on the ground. A gash the size of a man's hand was visible in the sidewall. It had likely hit an old fence post or a sharp rock hidden in the hard soil. He found Frank sitting in the shade of his pickup at the edge of the field, staring at the crippled machine. His face was pale beneath his tan. "Tough break, Frank," Art said, keeping his voice neutral. Frank didn't look at him. "Tough is the word for it," he muttered. "Called Henderson. He said the service truck can't get out here until tomorrow morning. A tire that size. He said it'll be close to $1,000. $1,000 for a damn tire." He kicked at a clod of dirt. "I don't have it. The bank. They've already frozen my operating line. Said with corn prices where they are, I'm overextended." Art looked at the massive tractor, a monument of modern engineering, sitting useless in the dirt. It was too heavy to run on one tire, and changing it required specialized jacks and tools that Frank, like most farmers who relied on the dealership, didn't own. "I've got a floor jack and some blocks in the shop," Art offered. "We could probably get it high enough to pull the wheel. Maybe take it into town ourselves, see if the tire shop can patch it." Frank finally looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and resentment. "What's the point, Art? Even if we get it patched, what am I going to do? I can't afford fuel. I can't afford the payment on this thing. I'm drowning." He gestured vaguely at Art's Farmall M, sitting patiently in the next field. "You and that museum piece. You don't know what it's like." Art didn't argue. He just nodded. "Well, the offer stands if you change your mind." He walked back to his own tractor, the dust puffing up around his worn work boots. He climbed onto the familiar iron seat and fired up the engine. The simple, rhythmic pop, pop, pop was a comforting sound in the anxious silence of the afternoon. His tractor was light enough that it barely compacted the dry soil, and its smaller cultivator didn't need the brute horsepower or the expensive tires of the machine sitting defeated in the next field. As he worked, he watched the sun glint off the useless green giant, a powerful symbol of a dream that was beginning to crack. The first fissures in Frank Gable's empire weren't caused by a banker in a suit, but by a simple piece of sharp steel hidden in the unforgiving Iowa dirt. The dry summer of 1980 bled into a disastrously lean fall. The harvest was poor, and the prices were worse. But the real storm, the one Mr. Abernathy had warned of, broke that winter. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their crusade against inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21.5%. For the American heartland, it was a death sentence. Variable rate loans, once the key to rapid expansion, became anchors pulling farmers under. The math was simple and brutal. A man who had borrowed $100,000 at 8% suddenly found himself paying 20%. The payments didn't just increase, they became impossible. The value of farmland, the very asset that secured all those loans, began to plummet as desperate farmers tried to sell off parcels to raise cash. The bubble had burst. The first foreclosure auction was for a young family south of town. The whole community turned out, standing in the cold November wind, their faces grim. They weren't there to bid. They were there to bear witness, a silent, collective act of mourning. The auctioneer's voice, usually so full of energy, sounded hollow as he sold off a family's life, piece by piece. By the spring of 1982, the red and white auction signs were a common sight along the county roads, like grotesque flowers blooming in the ditches. Frank Gable's sign went up in April. The bank had called his notes. There was no way he could pay. Art drove to the auction with a heavy heart. He parked his pickup down the road and walked up the long lane, the same lane he'd seen Frank's new equipment drive down so many times. The farmstead looked neglected, the paint peeling on the house, weeds taking over the flower beds Sarah had always admired. Frank's machinery was lined up in the yard, a silent parade of broken dreams. The mighty 4630, the massive Morton shed, the gleaming black pickup, all of it was being sold to the highest bidder. He saw Frank standing near the barn with his wife and 2 young sons. He looked like a ghost, his face gaunt, his eyes vacant. He had aged 10 years in 2. Art saw Bill Henderson there too, clipboard in hand, moving through the equipment, making notes. He wasn't a friendly dealer anymore. He was a creditor, a vulture picking over the bones, looking to buy back his own iron for 10 cents on the dollar to resell it. The auctioneer started with the small items, tools from the shop, livestock equipment, household goods. Then he moved to the main event. The John Deere 4630 was first. It looked magnificent, even covered in a layer of dust. The auctioneer began his rhythmic chant, but the bidding was sluggish. Money was tight, and no one had the cash or the credit for a machine that size. Henderson made a lowball bid. Another implement dealer from a neighboring county raised him slightly. Art watched Frank flinch with every bid, each call from the auctioneer, another nail in the coffin of his pride. Art hadn't come to buy anything, but a cold anger began to build in his chest. An anger at Henderson, at the bankers, at the whole system that had encouraged this, then punished it so cruelly. He thought of his own farm, his own security. He thought of the cash he had carefully saved, the nest egg that was earning steady, if unspectacular, interest in a savings account. He had survived because he had refused to play their game. He was debt-free. His land was his machines were his. While Frank's empire crumbled, Art's small, self-reliant kingdom stood firm. He wasn't just surviving, he was solvent. He looked at the 80-acre parcel of land that was being sold after the equipment, the parcel next to his, the one Frank had bought at the peak of the boom. It was good, flat, black dirt. And Art knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, what he had to do. The vindication he felt wasn't triumphant or loud. It was a quiet, solid, and deeply satisfying thing. It was the feeling of a man who had been right all along, not because he was smarter, but because he was wiser. The auction for the land began. The bank's representative started the bidding, a number that was a fraction of what Frank had paid for it just a few years earlier. A few land speculators from the city made half-hearted bids, trying to steal it. Then Art stepped forward. "I'll bid 100,000, he said. His voice was calm but carried across the silent crowd. It was a fair price, more than the speculators were offering, but far less than its peak value. It was also nearly all the cash he had in the world. The speculators looked at him, then at each other, and shook their heads. The auctioneer called for other bids. Silence. He looked at the banker, who gave a slight nod. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the tense air. "To Arthur Miller." A murmur went through the crowd. Art didn't look at them. He looked at Frank Gable. For a long moment, their eyes met across the yard. In Frank's gaze, Art saw the ruin of a man, but he also saw something else, something he hadn't seen in a decade, a flicker of respect. The fool had just bought the king's land. A week after the auction, as the last of the sold equipment was being hauled away from the Gable farmstead, Frank's dusty pickup appeared in Art's lane. Art was in his workshop, grinding a valve for the old Farmall H, the familiar smell of hot metal and oil filling the air. He shut off the grinder and wiped his hands on a rag as Frank stepped through the open door. The younger man stood there for a moment, looking around the orderly shop. He looked at the tools hanging in their painted outlines, at the worn but well-maintained tractors, at the sturdy oak workbench his own grandfather could have built. It was a place of permanence, of history. It was everything his own farm was not. "Art," he began, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. I came to say I was wrong." The words came out hard, as if pried from his soul. "All those years, I laughed at you. Me, Henderson, all of us. We thought you were a dinosaur, stuck in the past." He shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Turns out you were the only one living in the real world. We were the ones living in a fantasy." Art leaned against the workbench. He didn't feel the need to say, "I told you so." The world had said it for him, loudly and cruelly. It was a tempting fantasy, Frank, easy to get caught up in. "You didn't," Frank stated. "It wasn't a question. That day at the dealership, Henderson called you a sentimental fool. I'll never forget it." He looked Art straight in the eye. He was wrong. You weren't sentimental. You were disciplined. And you weren't a fool. You were the wisest man in the county. I see that now. Frank's shoulders slumped. "We're losing the house. Moving in with my wife's folks over in Cedar County. I've got nothing left, Art. Nothing." Art let the silence hang for a moment. Then he pushed himself off the bench. "You've got your name. You've got your hands. And you know how to farm. That's not nothing." He walked over to a metal cabinet and pulled out 2 glass bottles of cold pop, handing one to Frank. "I didn't buy that 80 acres to dance on your grave, Frank. I bought it because it's good land, and it needed a steward who respects it." He took a long drink, then set the bottle down. "I'm going to need help farming it. It's more than I can handle on my own. I'll be needing to hire a man, starting this spring. The pay won't be great, not at first, but it's honest work. And once you get back on your feet, well, I'd be willing to rent that ground to you, on shares, a chance to start over." Frank stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from Art's steady gaze to the bottle in his hand, as if he couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. Tears welled in his eyes, the first Art had ever seen him show. He didn't try to hide them. He just nodded, unable to speak. It was an act of grace so profound it left no room for words. The news of Art's offer spread through the community faster than the news of the foreclosure. The perspective shifted. Art Miller wasn't the timid old fool anymore. He was the rock. He was the man who had weathered the storm, the one who had seen the truth when everyone else was blinded by the glare of new green paint. Farmers who had once smirked at his old tractors now stopped by his workshop, asking for advice on how to repair their own aging equipment, how to cut costs, how to survive. Bill Henderson's implement dealership, starved of the free-flowing credit it depended on, went bankrupt a year later. The building sat empty for a long time, a tombstone for an era of excess. The years rolled on. The 1980s were hard, but Art and Frank worked the land together, 2 men bound by the shared soil. Frank, humbled and hard-working, slowly rebuilt his life. He eventually saved enough to rent that 80 acres from Art, and then, years later, to buy a small farm of his own, a farm he paid for with calloused hands and hard-earned cash. The 2 men remained neighbors, their rivalry replaced by a deep, unspoken friendship forged in the crucible of failure and forgiveness. One warm summer evening, many years later, Art stood on his porch, now a grandfather with lines of wisdom etched around his eyes. His son David was in the workshop, teaching his own boy, young Tom, how to change the oil on the old Farmall M. The tractor's paint was almost gone now, faded to a soft, rosy patina. But the engine, as always, ran like a clock. Tom, his small hands covered in grease, looked up at his father. "Dad, why do we keep this old thing? Grandpa's got the 4020. It's so much bigger." David smiled, wiping a smudge of oil from his son's cheek with a thumb. "This tractor," he said, his voice echoing the lessons he'd learned a lifetime ago, "teaches us something the big ones can't. It teaches us that you don't need the newest, shiniest machine to do good work. It teaches us how to fix things ourselves, instead of just buying a new one. It reminds us that the goal isn't to have the most, Tom. It's to owe the least." From the porch, Art overheard the exchange, and a profound sense of peace settled over him. His legacy wasn't in the number of acres he owned, or the amount of money in his bank account. It was here, in this workshop, in the lessons being passed from one generation to the next. It was in the quiet confidence of knowing that his family's roots ran deep, anchored not in debt or pride, but in the solid ground of self-reliance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, David climbed onto the old tractor and fired it up. The familiar, comforting pop, pop, pop echoed across the yard, a steady, reliable heartbeat in the twilight. It was the sound of survival, the sound of wisdom. It was the sound of a sentimental fool who had kept his farm and his soul intact.